For more than 3 decades, the name Troy Aikman represented something almost extinct in modern sports: control. He was the quarterback who never unraveled, the star who never embarrassed the league, the champion who never seemed haunted by his own success. 3 Super Bowl rings, a legendary run with the Dallas Cowboys, and later, a smooth transition into broadcasting, where his calm voice and measured opinions made him one of the most trusted figures in football media. To the public, Troy Aikman looked like a man who had mastered both the game and life itself. But that version of Troy Aikman was only half the truth. Behind the carefully maintained image was another life, one built on silence, emotional distance, and physical damage that never made headlines. Not a life of scandal or deception, but a double life defined by endurance. For nearly 30 years, Aikman carried pressures and consequences no one saw, because he never allowed them to be seen. When Aikman entered the NFL in 1989 as the first overall pick, he didn't just join a team. He inherited a collapsing empire. The Cowboys were desperate for revival, and the expectations placed on him were suffocating. From day one, he understood the assignment: lead, stabilize, and never lose control. So that's exactly who he became. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He didn't demand attention. He became disciplined, restrained, and relentlessly professional. That restraint wasn't just a personality trait. It became his survival mechanism. Fans trusted him because he looked unbreakable. Coaches relied on him because he never panicked. Teammates followed him because he absorbed pressure without complaint. What no one considered was the cost of maintaining that composure year after year. Aikman played quarterback in one of the most brutal eras of football. Defensive hits were savage, and concussion protocols were almost non-existent. Over the course of his career, he suffered multiple head injuries, some severe enough to end games, others quietly ignored. At the time, admitting the long-term effects of brain trauma wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable, especially for a franchise quarterback. So Aikman did what leaders were expected to do. He endured. He took the hits, shook them off, and moved on. Pain became routine. Silence became habit. On Sundays, he was the commander in control. Off the field, he dealt with symptoms no one asked about, and he never offered explanations. That ability to compartmentalize didn't disappear when he retired. It followed him into the next phase of his life. When Aikman walked away from football in 2001, many assumed the hardest chapter was over. No more punishment, no more collisions, no more pressure. But retirement didn't bring peace. It brought a quiet disorientation. Football had given him structure, identity, and purpose since his youth. When it ended, the noise stopped, but the emptiness didn't. He was still admired, still wealthy, still relevant, but something fundamental was missing. Broadcasting filled the public gap. His role on Fox Sports restored visibility and authority, but it also required the same discipline he'd relied on as a player. He was still performing, still composed, still guarded. The helmet was gone, but the armor remained firmly in place. Privately, Aikman lived a life of distance. He avoided celebrity culture and rarely spoke about his inner world. To outsiders, he seemed reserved. To those closer to him, emotionally difficult to reach. Decades of emotional control had taught him how to lead, but not how to open up. Vulnerability had never been part of the role he played for so long. In 2000, his marriage to publicist Rhonda Worthy appeared to be another chapter of stability. 2 daughters, a high-profile but orderly family life. Then quietly it ended. Their 2011 divorce came without scandal, without public accusations, and without explanation. The absence of drama only deepened the mystery. Those who knew Aikman well understood that years of emotional isolation, shaped by injury, pressure, and relentless self-control, made true intimacy difficult. He had spent most of his life being strong for everyone else, without ever learning how to be emotionally present for himself. And still, no one questioned the image. Because Troy Aikman never collapsed. He never spiraled. He never self-destructed. He didn't ask for sympathy or attention. He succeeded silently, suffered silently, and moved forward without complaint. In a culture that only recognizes pain when it explodes, quiet endurance goes unnoticed. Only recently has that begun to change. In subtle interviews and careful reflections, Aikman has started to speak, not dramatically, not bitterly, but honestly, about the physical and emotional cost of his career, about concussions, about perspective, about how differently he views his football years now. It isn't a confession. It's a release. For the first time, the public icon and the private man are beginning to merge. And when you look back with that understanding, Troy Aikman's story stops being just about championships and legacy. It becomes a story about what happens when a man spends decades being exactly what the world demands, while quietly losing touch with what he needs himself. By the time Troy Aikman entered his 40s, something had quietly shifted. The routines were still there. The professionalism never slipped. From the outside, his life looked calm and complete. But internally, the long-suppressed weight of decades began to surface, not as a breakdown, but as a reckoning. For years after retirement, Aikman told himself he was fine. That was the habit. Football had trained him to normalize discomfort, to distrust weakness, to keep moving no matter what lingered beneath the surface. But as time passed, the physical echoes of his playing days refused to stay silent. Headaches appeared without warning. Concentration came and went. Fatigue felt different, deeper, heavier, harder to explain. What unsettled him most wasn't the pain. It was the realization that he had never been taught how to listen to it. In the 1990s, the NFL rewarded durability, not self-awareness. You played hurt. You stayed quiet. You didn't ask questions about tomorrow. Aikman had done everything right by the standards of his era, yet those standards had never prepared him for life after the noise stopped. The applause faded. The structure dissolved. And without football to absorb his identity, he was left alone with questions he had postponed for decades. Broadcasting kept him anchored to the game, but it also prolonged the performance. Every Sunday, he stepped into a familiar role, authoritative, composed, controlled. Viewers heard confidence. What they couldn't hear was how carefully that confidence was managed. Speaking about football was easy. Speaking about himself was not. Off camera, the emotional distance that once protected him began to feel like isolation. Relationships were polite, functional, but guarded. He was present, yet removed. The discipline that once made him elite now made him unreachable. He had mastered leadership, but intimacy remained foreign territory. This was the true cost of the double life. Not deception, but disconnection. Over time, Aikman began to look back, not with regret, but with clarity. He recognized how often he had chosen silence over honesty, control over expression. He saw the culture around him had praised toughness while ignoring its aftermath. And slowly, cautiously, he started to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but truthfully. He acknowledged concussions. He admitted that he would think differently if he were making those choices today. He stopped romanticizing the violence of the game and began describing it as it was, necessary for success, but far from harmless. These weren't accusations. They were reflections, the kind that only come when someone no longer feels the need to protect an image. For fans, these moments felt subtle. For Aikman, they were monumental. Because for the first time, he wasn't speaking as the quarterback, the broadcaster, or the symbol of stability. He was speaking as a man, reclaiming ownership of his own narrative. What makes Troy Aikman's story so unsettling isn't that he suffered. It's that he did so quietly, successfully, and with universal admiration. His double life wasn't hidden because it was shameful. It was hidden because no one thought to ask whether the most reliable man in the room was carrying anything at all. Now, as the years move forward, the separation between the two lives grows thinner. The public figure remains respected. The private man, finally acknowledged, is allowed to exist without armor. And in that space between who he was expected to be and who he actually is, Troy Aikman's legacy takes on a deeper meaning. Not just a champion, not just a leader, but a man who spent decades being strong for everyone else, before learning, at last, how to be honest with himself. There comes a point in every quiet life when silence no longer feels like strength. For Troy Aikman, that moment did not arrive with a scandal, a diagnosis, or a dramatic collapse. It arrived slowly, through reflection, through age, through the realization that surviving something is not the same as understanding it. For most of his life, Aikman believed control was the same as balance. If he stayed composed, if he stayed disciplined, if he stayed productive, then everything must be fine. That belief had carried him through the most violent years of professional football and into a respected second career. But as the years passed, he began to notice something unsettling. The applause still existed, yet it no longer reached him the way it once did. Achievements felt distant. Praise felt muted. The world still saw the symbol, while he increasingly felt like the man behind it had been left behind. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Not the rise, not the fall, but the long middle stretch where a person functions so well that no one realizes they are carrying unresolved weight. Aikman didn't resent football. He didn't disown his legacy, but he stopped romanticizing it. He began to see his career not just as a triumph, but as a transaction, success exchanged for silence, leadership earned through self-denial. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask questions he had avoided since his 20s. Who was he without the role? Who was he without being needed? And what had it cost him to always be the steady one? As these questions surfaced, so did a different kind of honesty. Not loud, not attention-seeking, just clear. In interviews, his language softened. He spoke less like a defender of the past and more like someone willing to examine it. He acknowledged that the culture he thrived in did not protect players, that toughness was rewarded while vulnerability was discouraged, that the consequences didn't end when the career did. What made this shift powerful was not what he revealed, but how late it came. Aikman had spent decades being praised for never breaking, only to realize that breaking was never the real danger. Being disconnected was. His double life was never about hiding something dark. It was about living so long inside an expectation that he forgot to check whether it still fit. The quarterback, the broadcaster, the leader. These identities were real but incomplete. And for the first time, he allowed space for the rest of himself to exist without explanation. Today, Troy Aikman is still admired, still respected, still composed. But there is something different now, something quieter and more human. He no longer seems interested in being invulnerable. He seems interested in being truthful. And that may be the most difficult transition of all. Because in a world that celebrates strength above all else, admitting the cost of that strength takes courage of a different kind. Not the courage to take a hit, but the courage to finally feel it. When history looks back on Troy Aikman, it will remember the championships, the leadership, the calm authority. But beneath that legacy lies something more enduring. A reminder that even the most reliable figures can carry unseen burdens. That success does not cancel suffering. And that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do, after a lifetime of control, is to stop pretending that control was ever free. As time went on, Troy Aikman began to reconcile with a truth he had long ignored. His body, worn down from years of brutal hits, began to reveal the cost of a career built on quiet endurance. The silence that had once served him as strength now felt like a cage. Aikman's decision to retire early was not just a reaction to the wear and tear on his body. It was also the culmination of a lifetime spent hiding the consequences of that very strength. He left the game at the height of his career, 3 Super Bowl titles in hand, but the relief he felt wasn't the kind of triumphant peace fans expected. Instead, there was an eerie quiet. The noise of the field had faded, but so did the sense of purpose that had driven him for so many years. In retirement, Aikman began to look inward. For the first time, he questioned the price of his success. He had been the epitome of toughness, a leader who never cracked under pressure. But in those moments of reflection, he realized how much he had sacrificed in the name of perfection, how much of himself he had left behind on the field. Physically, he was still dealing with the aftermath of countless injuries. Concussions, which were once seen as part of the game, had left lingering effects. But it wasn't just the physical toll that weighed on him. It was the emotional cost. Aikman had spent years suppressing feelings of doubt, fear, and isolation, convinced that true strength meant never showing weakness. But as the years went by, those emotions began to surface in ways he couldn't ignore. He had always been the strong one, the one who was counted on to lead his team, to be the rock in moments of crisis. But who was he when he was no longer on the field? What was left of him when the crowd stopped cheering, when the spotlight faded? In the quiet of retirement, Aikman began to grapple with these questions. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate. But over time, he started to open up, not to the public, not to the media, but to those closest to him. He began to acknowledge the pain, the sacrifices, and the fears he had carried in silence for so long. His journey of self-reflection wasn't a sudden revelation, but rather a slow process of understanding the true cost of fame, success, and toughness. The person the world knew as the unbreakable quarterback was, in reality, a man who had endured far more than anyone ever realized. And for the first time, Troy Aikman began to face those hidden truths, not just as a football legend, but as a human being. As Troy Aikman continued to face the quiet struggles of retirement, something unexpected began to shift. For years, he had lived under the constant pressure of being the perfect quarterback, the man who never faltered, never showed weakness, and never let the pain or the doubt seep through. But as the years wore on, the facade began to crack. It wasn't just about his physical injuries anymore. It was about the emotional toll he had paid in silence. Aikman started to open up in ways that shocked many who had once seen him as the epitome of stoic strength. For years, his personal life had been kept under wraps. His marriage to Rhonda Worthy had appeared picture-perfect to the outside world. But behind closed doors, the pressures of living up to the ideal of the perfect family began to take their toll. His marriage ended in 2011, not because of public scandal, but because of the quiet, unspoken struggles they both faced. The divorce marked a turning point for Aikman. It forced him to confront the fact that he had been running from more than just his physical injuries. He had been running from himself. He had built a life around the image of strength, success, and control, but that image had been built on the foundation of neglecting his own needs, his own emotions, and the parts of himself he had buried deep inside. In the years that followed, Aikman's perspective on his career and his life began to evolve. No longer bound by the expectations of fans and the NFL, he found a space to reflect on what he had truly accomplished and what he had lost along the way. The early retirement that had seemed like a choice made for his health now seemed like the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could finally explore who he was outside of the football field. In interviews, Aikman began to speak more candidly about his experiences. He admitted that the physical toll of playing quarterback had been far worse than anyone could have imagined. He spoke openly about the concussions, the chronic pain, and the long-term effects of the hits he took throughout his career. But he also acknowledged that the mental and emotional toll had been just as significant. The pressure to always be on, to always be the perfect leader, had left him emotionally drained. As Aikman entered his 50s, he found himself in a new kind of struggle. The spotlight had shifted away from him, and he no longer had to play the role of the untouchable icon. For the first time, he had the freedom to be human. And with that freedom came the realization that he had been hiding from the world and from himself for far too long. But unlike the strong, silent man of his playing days, Aikman didn't run from this new truth. Instead, he embraced it. In his own quiet way, he began to heal. It wasn't about redemption or trying to reclaim his legacy. It was about accepting the scars, physical, emotional, and mental, that he had accumulated over the years and finding peace in his own vulnerability. Today, Troy Aikman's legacy isn't just about the 3 Super Bowl championships, the Hall of Fame induction, or the broadcasting career. His true legacy is about the man who endured, who hid his struggles for years, and who finally found the strength to face them head-on. It's about the courage to admit that greatness comes with a cost, and that true strength is not about never breaking, but about finding the courage to heal. As time passed, and Troy Aikman continued to heal and reflect on his career, his personal growth began to resonate beyond just the confines of his own life. The once quiet, seemingly invincible quarterback had evolved into someone more in touch with his vulnerability and more willing to speak out on the issues that had long been silenced in the NFL. He had become an advocate for mental health and concussion awareness, issues he had once brushed aside in the pursuit of perfection. Aikman, who had spent years hiding behind the image of unshakable strength, was now actively using his platform to shed light on the dangers of the sport he had loved. He began to speak more openly about the long-term effects of playing football, about concussions, CTE, and the emotional toll the sport takes on its players, both during and after their careers. He wasn't just a symbol of NFL greatness anymore. He had become a voice for change, encouraging the next generation of players to think about their futures, their health, and their well-being in a way that was long overdue. In interviews, Aikman shared his experiences with concussion-related injuries and the lingering effects of his playing days. He talked about how the culture of the NFL had not prioritized player safety in the past, and how that neglect had impacted him and countless others. Aikman, who once embodied the image of the tough, silent warrior, now openly admitted the fears and challenges he faced in retirement. He reflected on the mental and emotional toll of being an athlete, especially one with such a high public profile. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this transformation was the way Aikman finally embraced his own humanity. He had spent so long compartmentalizing his pain and hiding his vulnerability that it took years for him to fully confront the toll it had taken on his mental health. And yet, through all of it, he found the strength to speak out and to inspire others to do the same. As Aikman continued to advocate for change, he also began to forge deeper connections with his family, his friends, and his colleagues. No longer burdened by the need to be perfect, he was able to cultivate genuine relationships that were built on understanding, empathy, and honesty. His journey of healing wasn't just about himself. It was about helping others understand that it was okay to not have it all together, to not always be the perfect leader, and to seek help when needed. In the end, Troy Aikman's story became one of redemption, not through his victories on the field, but through his ability to acknowledge the toll his success had taken on him and to use his platform to promote change. He became a role model for a new generation of athletes, showing them that true strength wasn't about never breaking, but about finding the courage to face the struggles within and to help others do the same. Troy Aikman's legacy now extends far beyond the football field. He is a man who went from being an untouchable icon to someone who shared his vulnerabilities and used his voice for good. His story is a testament to the power of self-reflection, healing, and the strength that comes from embracing one's flaws and imperfections. As the years passed, Troy Aikman's journey toward healing began to inspire more than just those who followed his career. His story resonated with countless athletes, both retired and active, who had experienced the silent suffering that Aikman had once endured in solitude. As the world continued to witness Aikman's transition from the icon of perfection to a man of depth and transparency, his impact reached far beyond the football field. Aikman's advocacy for player safety grew louder, and his word began to find an eager audience among fans, athletes, and even other leagues. He wasn't simply raising awareness about concussions and brain injuries. He was fighting for the mental well-being of players, and in doing so, he was shifting the culture of the NFL. The same league that once prized toughness above all else was slowly starting to acknowledge the human cost of the game. Despite his growing influence, Aikman never lost sight of the struggles he had faced. He remained humble about the attention his advocacy garnered, always keeping in mind that his own journey had been a quiet one until he chose to speak up. And it wasn't just about protecting the next generation of players. It was about sharing a message of hope for those who felt alone in their own struggles. As Aikman looked back on his time in the NFL, he also realized how much had changed in the league since his playing days. The conversations around health, both mental and physical, were evolving, and players were no longer expected to mask their pain in the same way that he had. That progress gave Aikman a sense of fulfillment that his Super Bowl victories never had. He had found a new kind of victory, the victory of vulnerability and the acceptance of imperfection. But the journey wasn't just about public advocacy. It was deeply personal for Aikman as well. He had spent much of his life avoiding the emotional side of himself, the side that felt fear, frustration, and sadness. In his quest to be a hero for others, he had neglected to be a hero to himself. Now, as a father, as a friend, and as a leader in the NFL community, Aikman understood that true strength wasn't about silencing the emotions that made him human. It was about acknowledging them, accepting them, and using them to help others. Aikman's story was no longer about the legendary quarterback who threw perfect passes or led his team to championships. It was about the man who found his voice after years of silence. It was about the courage to speak out, the bravery to face one's past, and the willingness to be vulnerable in a world that often prizes strength above all else. As he continued to navigate this new chapter of his life, Aikman became a beacon for those who had spent too long hiding behind masks of invincibility. He showed them that it was okay to not be okay, that healing was possible, and that the greatest legacy wasn't one defined by victories on the field, but by the impact one had on others' lives. Troy Aikman had given the world a glimpse of his true self, the one who had hidden behind the quarterback's helmet for years. Now, that man stood proudly, not as the untouchable icon, but as a human being who had faced the hardest battles of all, the battles within himself. And that was his real victory.